good to go.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Today, we are going to look at page 48. Actually, 48 was where we started last week. We're going to be studying page 49, but I am going to begin reading at the passage that we studied last week on page 48, beginning with the phrase, "This community is figured." Okay? So page 48, I will read last week's paragraph and then move on to the section for this week. And if you have any thoughts or comments, please feel free to send them in. Okay, I'll begin to read. This community is figured by the merchant service, which cannot, as the young chief mate had testified in that recourse to physical measures of enforcement, which turned into homicide, do without discipline and a code. It was by no chance freak that both captain and chief mate were graduates of the Conway, and the paradox entailed in their vindication of human responsibility belonged to the spiritual culture, the human world that had formed them, a culture necessary to the Conway ethos specialized within it. The two young ship's officers, as the tale makes plain, represent a very small minority, but they are far from being sports. Without a nuclear live presence of essential responsibility, discipline and code would be no better than mechanical habit, and the mechanical can deal only with the routine and the expected. Men, in any case, are not machines, and something in them responds to the challenge that what manifestly is a demonstration of essential human responsibility can't but be for them, and to the reminder of what is required of them by the life they focus. That both the captain and the chief mate each incurs the hostility of the rest of the ship's complement is far from disposing of the point. Lawrence's moral sense, then, is something like the antithesis of what the anti-Puritan enlightened think of as moral. It is what they hate immeasurably more because they fear it: human responsibility. In Lawrence, the human responsibility of genius. They fear it because whenever they are aware of it, it makes them feel their nothingness, and it too they call assuring themselves of their superiority, Puritanism. So Lawrence is a Puritan. Andreski, avowedly without conviction, refers despairingly to a needed ethical sense that might perhaps assert itself among the young, and this, clearly, he thinks of as an authoritative sense of responsibility. With nothing but the assumptions implicit in his logic and clarity to draw on, he can't suggest where, unless out of the common sense that for him is ultimate, it is to come from, or why it should have an efficacy that, in our civilization, it hasn't shown. Invoking common sense for its authority, it is to reinforce common sense. Human responsibility, as known to Lawrence and Conrad, we know they knew because they are great creative writers, is the manifest potency of life. Lawrence wrote in an early letter, "I can't forgive Conrad for being so sad and for giving in." And it is true that in knowing that he didn't belong to himself, Lawrence had, going with his strong sense of belonging, a positive ahnung of the nature of what he belonged to. One wouldn't confidently impute a comparable sense to Conrad, but one is sure that Conrad too would have said of such works as The Secret Sharer, The Shadow Line, and the great novels, quote, "Though I call them mine, I know they are not mine." I think I'd like to read on the next paragraph because I know we're gonna get to it today. So I'm gonna read on so we'll have our whole section in the beginning. So continuing. The thinking of all great writers, the representatively human quality of genius, being inseparable from its intense individuality, is distinctive, involving in each case a marked distinctiveness in the report on reality that is conveyed. But, however sharp the differences, the consideration to be stressed by anyone intent on vindicating English as a discipline of thought is that every great writer in the language belongs to the one collaboratively creative community. The discipline is not a matter of learning a deduced standard logic or an eclectic true philosophy, but rather of acquiring a delicate readiness of apprehension and a quasi-instinctive flexibility of response. These, informed by the intuited living principle, the principle implicit in the interplay between the living language and the creativity of individual genius. My interplay, which is manifested in the language as the writer uses it, is an intimation that I have in mind my point that a language is more than a means of expression. It embodies values, constatations, distinctions, promptings, recognitions of potentiality. This doesn't mean that it is univocal, implicitly dictating an ideal comprehensive conclusion. A product of collaborative creativity, it makes continued and advancing collaborative thought possible. And it will hardly be forgotten that such collaboration entails, vitally and essentially, disagreements. Finality is unattainable. So, let's go back to the paragraph beginning with the words human responsibility. Now, before we go back to that, I want to remind you that the previous two paragraphs, which I read, speak of human responsibility as a central theme. Human responsibility is the moral sense. Andreski desperately wants some kind of an authoritative moral sense to introduce itself within his discipline, but there isn't one. Levis considers human responsibility and the human responsibility associated with creative genius to be key. So let's look at this paragraph. Human responsibility, as known to Lawrence and Conrad, we know they knew because they are great creative writers, is the manifest potency of life. A few minutes ago we said that human responsibility equals the moral sense. Now they're saying it equals the manifest potency of life. Manifest potency of life. So that is the core of the sentence. Human responsibility is the manifest potency of life. So let's understand the core of the sentence first. Then we'll go back and catch all the things that we left out. So in this case, I think we need to look at the meanings of the words. Manifest. Manifest means that which makes it visible. It demonstrates it. Human responsibility is the demonstration of the potency of life. Potency. Potency suggests a word that potential. Potential is something which is not here yet, but can come in the future. So it is a forward-looking energy, an energy which can bring about a result in the future. Potency also has a literal meaning. Potency. The ability to become a father to a child. If a person is impotent, they cannot become the father of a child. So when we talk about the potency of life, it suggests an energy which gives, it doesn't give birth like the woman gives birth, but it impregnates, it engenders, it creates new life. Creates new life. So, human responsibility is the demonstration of the energy which has the ability to create new life. Now, not literal babies, but human life in its newness as it continues being regenerated and recreated in the continuity of history. There's always something new in human experience. And the human responsibility is the demonstration of this creative energy. I believe that's the meaning of the core of the sentence. Let's look at what was left out. Human responsibility, as known to Lawrence and Conrad. So, as known to means human responsibility in the sense in which Lawrence and Conrad would experience it. Human responsibility to me will mean something different than it would to Lawrence and Conrad. They, being great creative writers, have a responsibility to tell the truth to the world about what they see in reality. So this is the responsibility of a creative writer. So human responsibility, as it is known by creative writers, is the manifest potency of life. We have to really think about this to see what Levis is trying to say. But it is not just any human responsibility, it is the responsibility of the creative writers who are the eyes of humanity and the mouth of humanity. They see reality and speak it in stories so that other people, regular people, can understand the depth of human experience. It is their responsibility to do this. And in this responsibility, we see the development of life, of human life. Now, there was another phrase I left out. Human responsibility as known to Lawrence and Conrad. And then it says, dash, we know they knew because they are great creative writers. We know is in italics, meaning we know it must be true. That they knew human responsibility in a creative writer's way because they are creative writers. The very fact that a person is a great creative writer means he knows that sense of responsibility to speak the truth. Just like a scientist knows his responsibility to tell the truth in his papers that he publishes about scientific findings. And a judge knows it is his responsibility to render a just judgment and not to take a bribe. We know it in our hearts. And a great creative writer knows that his responsibility to tell the truth is to tell the truth. And Levis says that responsibility is the manifest potency of life. Moving on. Lawrence wrote in an early letter means early in his life, when he was a young man. I can't forgive Conrad for being so sad and for giving in. Now, I did not understand this quote, and I asked Olavo about it. And Olavo said that Conrad was depressed all his life, that he was pessimistic about humanity, pessimistic about life, pessimistic. Pessimistic is the opposite of optimistic. And both of them refer to an attitude toward life. A pessimist believes the bad is going to happen and sees bad things wherever he looks. An optimist believes the good is going to happen and sees hope wherever he looks. According to Olavo, Conrad was a pessimist and he was depressed. All his life. Now, what does it mean to give in? Give in is an idiom, sort of. It literally means to capitulate. That's a word you can look up in the dictionary. Capitulate. It means to admit defeat and to stop trying to resist a negative force. So apparently, according to Lawrence, Conrad gave in to his pessimism and to his sad view of the world. At least that's what Olavo thinks. Olavo said he hadn't read a whole lot of Conrad, but that was his impression.
Margarita.
Yes.
It's a question.
Question.
There's a student asking whether to give in has the same meaning as to give up.
The question is, to give in, does it mean the same as to give up? Not exactly. Not exactly. It's close. Very close. If someone gives up, they often give in. They go together, but they don't mean the same thing. To give up is to cease striving, to stop trying. If you are running a race and you're so tired, you can give up. I'm not going to finish the race. If I'm taking a class and I am totally lost and I failed two tests, maybe I'll give up and just quit going to class. Give up means to stop trying. Give in has more to do with a relationship between two people or two entities. To give up is something you do by yourself. I stop. But to give in, you are actually allowing something else to win. It's more of a relational thing. And also, when you give in, the implication is that someone is putting pressure on you. Someone is trying to force you to do something, and you give in to the pressure that the person has put on you. So it's slightly different. Does that make it clear? Okay, let's see, where are we? Okay, so I'm going to continue reading after the bit about Conrad is sad and he's giving in. And by the way, the giving in of Conrad, maybe it's to the pessimism that was pressing upon him and causing him to lose hope, give up his hope in trust in humanity, etc. Okay. And it is true that in knowing that he didn't belong to himself, Lawrence had, going with his strong sense of belonging, a positive ahnung of the nature of what he belonged to. Okay, so let's find the core of this sentence. And it is true that, in knowing that he didn't belong to himself, Lawrence had, going with his strong sense of belonging, a positive ahnung of the nature of what he belonged to. Okay, so it is true that points us to the core idea of the sentence. So I won't bother to write that down. That is not so important at this point. So we'll leave that out for the moment. In knowing that he didn't belong to himself, Lawrence had a positive ahnung of the nature of what he belonged to. I believe the core is Lawrence had a positive ahnung of the nature of what he belonged to. So let's write that down for our core. Okay, let's start at the back of the sentence. The nature of what he belonged to. Let's even go to the beginning again. in knowing that he did not belong to himself, right? In knowing that he didn't belong to himself. Okay, to belong to yourself. To belong is ownership. If you do not belong to yourself and you belong to someone else, it's like you are a slave. You are owned. Lawrence knew that he didn't belong to himself. But what did he belong to? What did Lawrence belong to? Let's think about it for a minute. We have spoken of it in previous sessions. We have spoken of a life force that is kind of diffuse, like light or power or energy, that focuses inside an individual and then shines back out, where the individual is like a prism and light shines in and then shines back out, broken into colors and different appearance through a focal point. We have called this various names. One of them was the living principle. You could consider it truth. You could consider it reality. You could consider it God. It's something out there. What is the nature of this? Well, it is non-personal. It is big and diffuse. What else? What is the nature of it? Is it spiritual? Is it in the third dimension? Okay, so the nature of what he belonged to. It says Lawrence had a positive unknown of the nature of what he belonged to. Okay, what's an unknown? We spoke of that a long time ago as being like a premonition and sort of like a feeling of an intuition, particularly usually about the future, often kind of spooky or negative. But I think perhaps we could call it an intuition, or even an idea, an inkling, an idea. Inkling, that's a small piece of an idea. Inkling.
Margarita?
Yes.
Can you move the whiteboard a little bit backwards?
Straight back.
Just a little. Yeah, that's perfect.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay. Okay, so Lawrence had an idea of the nature of what he belonged to. A small idea, a feeling, an intimation, an intuition, an inkling. But it was a positive unknown. That means, in this context, it sort of means specific. If I have no idea whatsoever, that's one level. If I have a little bit of an idea, that's another level. If I have a positive idea that begins to take a shape, that means I know some things for sure. So this means Lawrence had more than just an inkling, more than just a feeling, more than just a little intuition or unknown of the nature of what he belonged to. He actually had somewhat of a positive idea. It was more than just a very subtle thought. So, in knowing that he didn't belong to himself, Lawrence had a positive unknown of the nature of what he belonged to. Now, in knowing that he didn't belong to himself suggests that this whole piece is embodied within this state of being. The fact that he knew he wasn't his own went along with and implied that at the same time, he did know something of the nature of what he belonged to. So, he was very definite and made the statement clearly that he did not belong to himself. And at the very same time, he had a positive sense of the nature of what he belonged to. And it began with, "It is true that." Usually we use "it is true that" when we are making some sort of a concession. For example, maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure why he used the phrase, "it is true that." Let's read a little bit more of the context again. I'm going to just start at the beginning so I can get a little bit of a feel for this context. Human responsibility, as known to Lawrence and Conrad, we know they knew because they are great creative writers, is the manifest potency of life. Lawrence wrote in an early letter, "I can't forgive Conrad for being so sad and for giving in." And it is true that, in knowing that he didn't belong to himself, Lawrence had, going with his strong sense of belonging, a positive unknown of the nature of what he belonged to. So I actually missed something. I missed the part about going with his strong sense of belonging. So, in knowing that he didn't belong to himself, and going with his strong sense of belonging, he felt that he didn't belong to himself, but he did belong to something else. Going with those two things, he had a positive idea of the nature of what he belonged to. Okay. One wouldn't confidently impute a comparable sense to Conrad. So, Levis believes that Lawrence had a better, more specific, more concrete understanding of all this than Conrad did. Levis does not believe that Conrad had a similar sense to what Lawrence had. But one is sure that Conrad, too, would have said of such works as The Secret Sharer, The Shadow Line, and the great novels, "Though I call them mine, I know they are not mine." So, if he could make that statement, that means he does have somewhat of an inkling that he doesn't belong to himself, but that he belongs to something outward and he is channeling something beyond himself. But he's sad and he has given in, so he probably doesn't have as much of a feeling as Lawrence. Let's move on to the next paragraph. The thinking of all great writers, the representatively human quality of genius being inseparable from its intense individuality, is distinctive. involving, in each case, a marked distinctiveness in the report on reality that is conveyed. Okay, that's a big sentence and not too hard to take apart. Okay, the thinking of all great writers, the representatively human quality of genius, being inseparable from its intense individuality, is distinctive. Okay, I think there are essentially two main ideas joined into one sentence. The first sentence is, the thinking of all great writers is distinctive. The thinking of all great writers is distinctive. Okay, that is one thought. And distinctive can mean a few different things. We need the second thought to clarify the first. For example, distinctive could mean individualistic and unique to the thinker himself. For example, the thoughts of Albert Einstein were unique to him at the time. The thoughts of Sigmund Freud were unique. The thoughts of any great innovator, their thoughts are unique. So distinctive can mean unique to the individual. Or it could mean that the thinking of creative writers as a group is different from the thinking of other groups. For example, the thinking of plumbers, or the thinking of motorcycle riders, or the thinking of college chemistry professors. It could mean that the thinking of creative writers as a group is distinctive. So let's look at the second thought that is embodied right in the middle, that Levis infixes into the sentence. The representatively human quality of genius being inseparable from its intense individuality. So we have the representatively human quality. Of genius. Being inseparable from its intense individuality. Okay. Representatively human quality of genius. Representatively human quality means that this kind of thinking is typical and characteristic of humanity. It is representatively human. The apes, monkeys, do not think in this way. Even intelligent animals like elephants or dolphins cannot think in this way. Only human beings think in this way, and this kind of thinking is representatively human. It is distinctive to humans. Okay? So the representatively human quality of genius, and we're talking creative writing, creative genius. We're not talking about other kinds of genius. Being inseparable, cannot be separated from its intense individuality. Now this represents a bit of a paradox, because it began by saying, remember I said with distinctive, it could mean that it was unique to the individual. I.e., the thinking of Conrad is different from the thinking of Lawrence, which would be different than the thinking of Dickens or Blake or any of them. They all have their own flavor. I said distinctive could mean that. Or it could mean that all of the thinking is distinctive in the sense that it is representative of human creativity, as opposed to the physics or the psychology or something like that. Well, this phrase somewhat suggests this understanding that all of the thinking is representatively human. But this part, saying it's inseparable from its intense individuality, refers to this meaning of distinctive. So basically, the second thought clarifies that he means both meanings of distinctive in his thought, in Levis's thought. So he's saying, the thinking of all great writers, the representatively human quality of genius, being inseparable from its intense individuality, is distinctive. So it's distinctive on two levels. It's distinctive in that this kind of thinking is unique, the kind of thinking that all these men belong to and women. And then within the group, each individual has a distinctive kind of thinking. Okay? Involving, in each case, a marked distinctiveness in the report on reality that is conveyed. So, basically, this sentence is saying two things. It's talking about the fact that this kind of thinking is representatively human. And also, so it's representative of the experience of all humans. It's universally human. Every writer, their thinking is drawing from experience which is representatively human. But every writer writes something different. Every writer has his unique, distinctive report on reality. Report on reality. That's what it said, right? So, the creative writers, they all see human reality. They're seeing the same human reality. They're seeing a distinctively human reality. And then they put forth a report about what they've seen that is specific and unique to themselves. And they convey a different message. So again, we have the story of the blind philosophers who run into an elephant, and each one feels a different part of the elephant. One feels the trunk and thinks an elephant. They report that the reality of the elephant is that it's like a snake. And another feels the legs, and they report on reality that it's like an elephant is like a trunk of a tree. And another feels the tail and reports on reality that an elephant is like a whip. In the same way, creative writers are all reporting on the same elephant, which is human reality that has independent existence. Yet, they all give a different report. That's what that sentence is saying. So, let me read it again so you get the flow one more time. The thinking of all great writers, the representatively human quality of genius, being inseparable from its intense individuality, is distinctive, involving, in each case, a marked distinctiveness in the report on reality that is conveyed. And by the way, there are two words in there that add emphasis. One is intense individuality, and the other marked distinctiveness. Both of these give emphasis to the idea of uniqueness. Moving on. But, however sharp the differences, remember the differences in their reports, however sharp the differences, the consideration to be stressed by anyone intent on vindicating English as a discipline of thought is that every great writer in the language belongs to one collaboratively creative continuity. Okay, the but indicates a departure from the idea of the previous sentence. Now, the previous sentence emphasized the individuality of the reports, of the messages coming from different critics and different creative writers. But we must emphasize, stress, as he says it, that every great writer belongs to one collaboratively creative continuity. We've been saying from the beginning of this class, Levis has been saying that human experience forms a continuous, unbroken tradition from earliest times to present, and that the body, the corpus that you can see of the human experience is the body of literature. And with each ensuing piece of great literature, the tree grows, the continuity is extended. It's like a long river and people flow into it. Ideas continue to contribute, going on and on through time. Every great writer belongs to this single continuity. So no matter how individualistic they are, we don't have contradictions. We have only additions. No subtractions, only additions to the positive experience and the positive report of human experience that is the body of human literature. So let's make sure we understand this sentence. But, however sharp the differences, meaning the differences between the viewpoint of different writers, the consideration to be stressed by anyone intent on vindicating English as a discipline of thought is that every great writer in the language belongs to the one, collaboratively creative continuity. The one consideration to be stressed. It is a consideration that the writers are individual and have different reports. It is also a consideration that all of their reports, all of their kinds of thinking are representatively human, and they're all conveying thoughts about the same human experience. So Levis is saying, let's stress this one. Let's stress what they have in common. Let's stress with the elephant example that it is one animal and that everything they are saying is true of the animal. Every positive thing they say. Now, when they say something that is negative, for instance, when they say, he's not like a whip, he's like a tree. The part that was negative, he's not like a whip, was false. Because his tail is like a whip. But the part that was positive, he's like a tree, that was correct. So the positive impressions of human experience in the body of literature are all correct, though they might contradict one another. It's only the negatives. Life is not like that have more of a potential of being flat out wrong. So, and then also, anyone intent on vindicating English as a discipline of thought. Vindicating means that something was accused and convicted of wrongdoing, and you are now cleaning its reputation and bringing it forth as clean. You are declaring it not guilty. In Levis's day, English was being tossed aside as unimportant. Levis is vindicating it and saying, no, it is important. It is the discipline of thought, to study the body of literature, to understand how language reflects and shapes human experience. So we remember that's what he was talking about. So if you're intent on vindicating English as a discipline of thought, you want to stress the fact that all the great creative writers represent the same human experience and are worth studying. Okay, I'm going to move on. The discipline is not a matter of learning a deduced standard logic or an eclectic true philosophy. Okay, the discipline is our study of English. Originally, Levis was talking about an English school. And the idea being that as we study the development of language, of the English language and of the body of creative literature, over time, we'll see the unfolding of history and of language and of thought, values, ideas of the people of the times. And the discipline of this study, he says, is not a matter of learning a deduced standard logic or an eclectic true philosophy. In my day, right now, in the United States, we have something called the Standards of Learning, SOLs. This is something that we in education, we just kind of hate it. SOLs, standards of learning. In American schools, the quality of education has gone down steadily for the last 50 years. This is demonstrated by test scores. And recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years, the federal government has gotten involved and required schools to show progress of improvement. And in Virginia, at least, I don't know about the rest of the country, they implemented it using something called the Virginia Standards of Learning. So they took every subject, mathematics, English, biology, geography, social studies, everything, and they put together a list of facts and skills that a student must have mastered in order to pass. And you have to take SOLs at the 3rd grade, the 8th grade, and the 12th grade. And if you don't pass, you cannot graduate. And basically, it is a pack of index cards, each with a fact on it, that has thousands of facts. And the teachers can no longer teach creatively. Not that they were doing a good job in the first place, but now they have to teach to the SOLs. There is a specific set body of data that students have to memorize. And that's education. Well, what Levis is saying here is that the discipline of English is not that. It is not a body of information, a set true philosophy, a catechism. It is not a system of deduced logic. It says here, but rather, all right, I'll read the sentence. The discipline is not a matter of learning a deduced standard logic or an eclectic true philosophy. Eclectic means drawn from many sources. True philosophy. But rather, it is a matter of acquiring a delicate readiness of apprehension and a quasi-instinctive flexibility of response, these informed by the intuitive living principle. I'm going to stop there. The sentence goes on and on. Let's look at some of these things he says it is. Oops. Let's see. See if I can get this back up. Is that too much angled? Or is that okay? Or is it too high? Okay, it's kind of high for me.
High for you?
That's a little high, but I'm going to try it because I think it's okay. All right, let's see. The discipline is a matter of acquiring. A delicate readiness of apprehension. Delicate readiness of apprehension. A quasi-instinctive flexibility of response. Quasi-instinctive flexibility of response. these informed by the intuited living principle, the principle implicit in the interplay between the living language and the creativity of individual genius. Okay, let's get the second half later. Let's look at this first. First of all, acquired is in contrast to learned. It's sort of a technical term in education. To acquire is not the same as to learn. There's a difference. You acquire skills. Acquiring means changing who you are, growing. Learning more means cognitive. So acquiring has more of a process feel to it over time. Learning is more like SOLs, memorized data. So he says the discipline of English is a matter of acquiring a delicate readiness of apprehension. Now, I have to say, we have a phrase in English, loosey-goosey. A delicate readiness of apprehension, a quasi-instinctive flexibility of response. I can understand why educators would not like this. This is what they would call loosey-goosey. It means you cannot pin it down. You cannot test it. You cannot assess whether a person gets an A or a B or a C or an F. How do you know whether someone has a delicate readiness of apprehension or a quasi-instinctive flexibility of response? Actually, students come in with this. Some students show up to the first day of class with a delicate readiness of apprehension. Readiness of apprehension means to apprehend something is to see it, to experience it, to recognize it. A delicate readiness of apprehension. So if you're reading and you get a true feeling of something from a text, you've apprehended something. You have a delicate readiness to apprehend. And then you have the students who are dull. Students who can read a moving piece of literature and get nothing out of it at all. So to a certain extent, this can be a matter of talent. And then quasi-instinctive. Quasi means not exactly, but almost. Well, instinctive means they were born with it. It comes from within. To acquire an instinct can come with practice. You can train your instincts. But anyway, an instinctive flexibility of response. Well, that reminds me of the way the captain acted. He was flexible when he saw the situation with the Conway boy who had committed homicide. He was flexible. He knew that this was not a case for sending for the police. So acquiring a flexibility of response. And I think response doesn't just mean to situations in life, it means to situations in literature, where you say, well, maybe he's right about that, even though it looks like he's wrong. A flexibility of response. So, Levis is saying that rather than seeing this study as a body of information to be mastered, he sees it as a process of developing a certain kind of human being. A human being who has a delicate intuition, a readiness to apprehend reality, subtle reality, spiritual reality, and quasi-instinctive flexibility of response. Not a Pharisee, not a Puritan, not a legalist. A judge, a real judge, who can see situations as having an effect. And I think educators would call this loosey-goosey, but personally, I actually agree that the goal of education is to develop human beings, not just to instill a database into a brain. So I'll erase my loosey-goosey, and we'll go on to the second half of it. All of this being informed by the intuited living principle. So these things are informed by the living principle. Which must be intuited because it cannot be defined. We've spoken of that before. It must be individually apprehended, intuitionally. It cannot be defined. It's built into you through your human experience and your vicarious experience of empathizing with others through literature and through life. So, informed means these kinds of responses are not just random. They are trained by a principle that exists, even though it cannot be defined. A principle of human appropriateness, goodness, decency, rightness, humanity. Okay, these informed by the intuited living principle, the principle implicit in the interplay between the living language and the creativity of individual genius. Okay, now he's saying this principle, this living principle, is actually captured and contained. Not in the language alone, but in the interplay between the living language and the individual genius. Now, Olavo talked to me about this a lot, and it was hard for me to understand what he was saying. So I can't really give it to you as well as he tried to give it to me. Maybe he'll talk to you about it himself in a class, but he explained it this way. He said first that language is living, in that words have various meanings. Their meanings do not stay static. For example, if you have a rock, it will stay a rock. If it is granite, it's going to be granite. It's never going to become flint. You know, if it's a certain shape, it's going to stay that shape, basically. Words are not like that at all. A word will change in many ways all the time. They fluctuate. And even a word that has a certain meaning between you and me right now, I could pick up that word and use it in a slightly different way and communicate something different to you through my intonation, my eye contact, my gestures. Somehow my thought will be transferred to you through this same word, and you might burst out laughing at a new use of the word. And yet, it's the same word. Olavo said, words change their meanings and are used in new ways all the time. And once you use it in a new way, it has that new identity. And someone else can pick it up and use it in that way or slightly different, giving it a new identity. And so language grows and changes and fluctuates, and it contains the thought of humanity. It's almost a corporal form of the thought of humanity. And there is an interplay between the living language and the individual genius. So as the life in the word is out there, this person picks it up and gives it even more new life and changes it even further. So these things are informed by the living principle, which is contained in the interplay between the living language and the individual geniuses that are using it at any given time. My interplay, which is manifested in the language as the writer uses it, is an intimation that I have in mind my point that a language is more than a means of expression. It embodies values, constatations, distinctions, promptings, recognitions of potentiality. This doesn't mean that it is univocal. Univocal means it speaks with one voice. It has one message. Not at all. Imagine a river splashing against rocks in the rapids. The river is flowing generally in one direction, but when it hits a rock, it splashes in all directions. The voices that are embodied in the language of today go in all directions. We have communist voices and conservative voices, and we have religious voices. We have the voices of people crying out in despair. We have the voices of people speaking of hope, of change, of continuity. We have all the voices crashing against the rocks, and yet we all use the same language, and the language is moving forward. The language of humanity is not univocal, but it is unified in that we use the same words to embody the meanings of human experience. And we do not always agree, but there is a unity in the message. Just like the philosophers about the elephant didn't agree, but when you put it all together, it was talking about a coherent beast. There is a coherence to the message of humanity embodied in language. So it embodies values. For example, the Obama administration uses the word change. They use it to mean change towards socialism, perhaps. But change itself is a value. Constatations, distinctions, promptings, recognitions of potentiality. If any of those vocabulary words do not speak to you, in other words, if you want an explanation of any of those words, send us a chat. Because the words all seem clear to me, but I don't know which ones aren't clear to you. This doesn't mean that it is univocal, implicitly dictating an ideal, comprehensive conclusion. Yeah. A product of collaborative creativity. It makes continued and advancing collaborative thought possible. Okay. We are speaking of language, English, the living language. It is a product of collaborative creativity. So it is the result of many people putting out language in the form of writing, in the form of radio waves, books, whatever, working together to create clarity and communication, to create a vehicle of communication, a currency of communication. Each of us uses a word, and then others can use that word in the same way. Collaborative creativity.
Margarita.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, there's a question about vocabulary.
Okay, question.
One student asks what promptings mean.
Promptings. A student wants to know about promptings. If I see you not doing something that you should do and something that you want to do, but maybe you have forgotten, I'll give you a little hint. I'll remind you. That is prompting you to do it. For example, if my child forgets to say thank you when he receives a gift, I'll give him a little elbow. What do you say? That is a prompting. And then he remembers, thank you. So the language reminds us of something we wanted to do or remember, something we value but maybe have forgotten. It pokes us and says, get to it. That's what promptings are.
Another student asks if promptings or prompting is equal to readiness.
The question is prompting equal to readiness? Delicate readiness of apprehension? I don't think so. Prompting is an action I take toward you, or a person takes toward a direct object. Readiness is a characteristic of an individual. If I am ready, I am prepared to do something when the right moment comes. But to prompt someone is to see that they haven't done it, and you have to give them a push. So in a sense, it's almost an opposite of ready, because you have to push them to do it. They're not ready. They have to be pushed. Do you see that? Do you see a connection between readiness and prompting that I'm missing? Okay. All right, so that's how I see it. Any other questions? Feel free to ask. Okay, let's see. So this doesn't mean that the living language is univocal, speaking with one voice, implicitly dictating an ideal, comprehensive conclusion. You understand that, right? It's not making, the voice of humanity doesn't make one statement. It makes lots of statements all the time, contradicting each other. A product of collaborative creativity, it makes continued and advancing collaborative thought possible. Okay, so if I am thinking something in America and you are thinking something in Brazil, but you speak English, and I put forth some language, it will probe your thinking, and then you'll send me back an email, which will probe my thinking, and then I'll send you back an email, which will probe your thinking, and this goes on until one of us writes an essay that goes out to the world and is a breakthrough. And that person will not be me, it'll be you. This is collaborative thought. And the living language makes this kind of thought possible. If I was thinking and I didn't put out my language, then you couldn't follow my thought, and there wouldn't be collaborative thought. And it will hardly be forgotten that such collaboration entails, vitally and essentially, disagreements. Finality is unattainable. So, again, he is reinforcing the idea that within living language there's lots of different minds, lots of different ideas, lots of different reports on reality, lots of different perspectives. And as we think together, we will not always agree. We'll use the language, but we will disagree. And those disagreements are vital and essential. If there are no disagreements, then we're speaking with one voice. We have a phrase in English, if two people agree on everything, one of them is unnecessary. So it's good to disagree, to show that we are both part of this process. And the living language is our medium for collaborative thought. And finality is unattainable. We will never reach the comprehensive conclusion of what reality is all about. But the dialogue should go on.
Another question.
Question?
The same student who asked about the difference, or whether prompting was equal to readiness. He's asking now whether prompting is different from promptness.
Yes. The question is, that's the connection that we weren't seeing. The question is prompting different from promptness? Yes, it is different. Excuse me. Promptness is closer to readiness. To be prompt is to be on time. On time. Which means, if I say, come to my house at 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, you are there. You are prompt. It means to come at the right time. To do something not too late. At the right time that you said you would. Now, in order to be prompt, you must be ready. We say, are you ready to go? Yes, I am ready. Good. We need to leave now in order to be on time. So readiness is connected to promptness. But prompting is something different. It is a verb. And it is an action you do to someone. It has nothing to do with promptness, being on time, or being ready. So good question. The words they seem exactly alike. Are there any other questions about anything in these pages, these couple of pages? Because we're going to move on next week. Oh, next week really is Thanksgiving. I made a mistake last week, and I said that it was today, but it's not. It's next Thursday. So next Thursday we will be pre-recording. And so we'll have no questions. But if you have anything now, send it in. And we will pick up in about 5 minutes to close the class if we haven't heard from you. Nothing more right now, Alessandra. Okay, 5